Okay, so optimistic governance, high level, is just using the optimistic oracle to enforce off-chain governance decisions on-chain. Overview here. On-chain governance is more expensive and less flexible, but it's you know much more secure. Like you can enforce it on-chain once you make a decision on-chain. But the optimistic oracle is able to easily see the results of off-chain governance and then enforce them on-chain. So I'm planning to build out an integration with safesnap that'll let us lean into that strength. So safesnap is a combination of snapshot off-chain voting systems with transactions sent to a Gnosis safe, which is the industry standard multisig wallet. There's lots and lots of money locked up in Gnosis safes right now, and so all of that could be subject to optimistic governance once this module is built out. The current default enforcement mechanism is called reality.eth, and it has an escalation game, which is similar to UMA, but it doesn't really have like a tiebreaker or final resolution thing at the end as clearly defined as UMA does. So the security guarantees aren't as high. So our module would basically let safesnap users replace reality.eth with the optimistic oracle. And it's built to be modular, so it's not like a big lift there. Safesnap wasn't built only for reality.eth to work. Also want to point out Snapshot X, which I think, Farah, you sent me this. This is something Snapshot's working on with Starknet, and it'll have cheaper layer 2 voting, but it'll have a lot of the same downsides as regular on-chain voting. Like it'll be much cheaper, but it'll still be less flexible, and it'll still be more expensive than off-chain voting. The security guarantees will be better, though. So it might be preferable for treasuries that don't need the flexibility, or they're just too large to be secured by the optimistic oracle. And also their launch date is kind of like later on. They're targeting Q2 2022. Our module should be available before the end of Q1 and should be accessible to anybody that wants to use it. And we'll probably like tweak it and add some other optimistic governance options in addition to that. Initial launch partner. Right now I'm in conversations with the Super Uman DAO. So they're interested in doing this. I think it would be a good real world test case. Obviously, they're friendly partners, and they do want a lot of flexibility in their governance system. So they're looking at NFT-based governance. They're looking at like some cross-chain interactions. There's just like a whole lot going on. And so this could help them implement a more bespoke and somewhat complicated governance system while still having the oracle as a backstop and making sure that everything worked correctly. A cool thing about this too, just as a side note, they're building out part of the voting system in kind of like a editor that helps to write the code for them. And so if that code is wrong, but in the sense that it differs from their expressed wishes, the oracle could correct any mistakes in distribution of tokens, which is kind of neat. So you could basically say like, okay, this was wrong. I'm challenging this distribution. So that's pretty cool. This is also going to help them get more familiar with optimistic governance in general, since the super humans are really like a point of contact with so much of the ecosystem. So the more that they know how this works and why it's useful and what the current pain points are, the better they're going to be at going and pitching people on it and getting more teams onboarded. And it's not limited to safesnap either. So I think that we should think about other ways to use the oracle for optimistic governance. Like you could just have a vote on Twitter and then enforce it on chain, and you'd be able to go and see what the results were on Twitter. There's some caveats to that. I mean, I guess you could like delete your Twitter post. There's like various ways to tweak a centralized service, but just like high level concept, assuming that the post doesn't get deleted, you could go and enforce the results. But I don't think we should go too deep into that rabbit hole until we see how the safesnap integration performs, because that's actually, it would open up a lot of assets to optimistic governance right out of the gate. And it would be really easy to fit that into DAO's existing workflows. So I think if the safesnap integration doesn't really catch on or nobody's interested in it, it might be a sign that the time might not be right, or we need like a different type of solution and need some rethinking. It should be also a pretty small project. It's kind of like protected tokens in that sense, where the technical lift here is not that big, probably like bigger. with safesnap than with protected tokens, but I could just get it done solo without pulling engineering resources. And then one last thing is that you could actually use protected tokens for optimistic governance too. So let's say you fund a distributor wallet with protected tokens. The owner or owners of that wallet distribute the tokens according to governance rules. And if any tokens are misallocated, you can expire the protected token contract early. And that means you don't actually need to trust the holder of the protected tokens. So right now, where multi-sigs are reigning, like every decision around distribution generally goes through some kind of multi-sig or some kind of trusted party. With this, you could actually say, here's what our decision-making process is, and we're going to give these protected tokens to somebody to pass around. And if they deviate from the instructions, which could be pretty open-ended, then we can cancel it and claim the underlying assets. And the recovery tokens would still be held in some kind of secure multi-sig, but that means you don't have to use the multi-sig that much. So the UX is a lot better there. As with most applications, it would work better with a helper contract for matching the protected and recovery tokens. So I'm hoping to work on that after the safesnap module. But this is just kind of like what I'm talking about, where we're not just limited to safesnap for optimistic governance. We can just enforce whatever mechanism. So protected tokens are one example. And Q&A, hope to have more code by now, but the protected token launch took up more time than I expected in the beginning of the year. So still aiming to have an implementation by the end of January for testing at least. And I'm curious if other people have thoughts around optimistic governance. And I'm also curious how we think we could safely accommodate a huge treasury that wants to use this. Because this is the kind of thing that could blow up the profit from corruption, cost of corruption model really quickly, which means that we would need some kind of a fee mechanism to drive up the cost of corruption. So just want to get on that. Like the KPI options, they drive up the TVL kind of ratcheting over time, but across or something like optimistic governance could just be like, here's $100 million all at once, deal with this. And at a certain point, we need to bump up the cost of corruption to make sure the Oracle stays secure.
That's really cool, John. I really like the super Uman emphasis there. And two questions for you, or one quick question around the TVL bit. So I know that we're experimenting with fee models or thinking through it. Something that I've always envisioned for UMA, but I don't have all the details hammered out, is that basically the people who are using UMA would own it, right? So let's say Uniswap did this, I would want their DAO to own several $1 million of UMA tokens. I'm not really sure that implies economic guarantees other than just the addition of if they were buying them. I'm just curious if maybe this isn't directly related to protected tokens or to optimistic governance, but if they sort of became participants in our voting system and you saw each other DAO that was participating in optimistic governance owned a bunch of UMA tokens, do we think that would start to address some of the security concerns there?
I personally think that it could. And if the mechanism for them doing that is just buying them on the open market, that would drive up the spot price, which is the easiest way for us to calculate what the cost of corruption is. Assume that you could buy 51% of the UMA tokens at the current market price, which you never can at any point. But if you could, and it still wouldn't be profitable for you to do that, then you're in pretty good shape. So if Uniswap went and just bought a few $1 million worth of UMA from various markets, I don't know exactly what that would do to the price. I'm curious, but I think that would be a nice drive up the UMA market cap and therefore the cost of corruption mechanism, while also integrating them into the actual governance system. So I agree with that. Yeah. That vision where the protocols that rely on UMA are the ones that are voting with UMA. And their main thing is to make sure that the Oracle always works, not just for their own projects, but in general.
Yeah. And this kind of circles around to this idea that Hart had proposed a while back around having having other DAOs participate in our voting, and we would need it to be an optimistic governance, right? So you would imagine that Uniswap voters would vote on what Uniswap's vote is going to be. And so they would all vote on, say, Uniswap, let's just say it's a yes, no vote on a NUMIP. They would, I think, all participate in Snapshot, and then they would optimistically submit their answer. And so the question wouldn't be like yes or no. It would be like, I think the way it would work is it would be like, was Uniswap's vote yes or no? And that would be like the proposal, right? That would then be subsequently converted to a NUMA vote. I'm not really sure of the details here, but you could use the optimistic voting system to allow other DAOs to vote in UMA, I think. I don't know. I might be talking crazy here.
I think the problem you run into there is if the vote was wrong or deviates from what the snapshot said, then you would challenge it and you would go to like a DVM system, and it's kind of like a recursive thing. So I think you probably need to like delegate that voting to like some entity, like it's a multisig, whatever, but just like some person or people that's in charge of making sure they vote correctly. And another reason you want to do that is if you have a bunch of UMA, you want to get those voting rewards. So the more likely scenario isn't like you were able to affect the outcome of vote. It's just that your incorrect answer is going to get rejected by the other people, and then you lose voting rewards.
Yeah, no, you're right. I'll make one final comment and then leave it to others. Just seeing kind of what could be built with this in the future, I'd really like to see this flushed out and shown to the world. So like we're going to build kind of the V1 around the safesnap kind of integration, but this like what could happen in the future with regard to it not being limited to safesnap, et cetera. I just think that would be a really cool idea for the world to wrap their head around, like on ETH research or something else. And so that people like further envision what can be built with UMA down the line, even if it's not like, 2022. Good stuff. I'm done.
One small response I want to give to what John said is that I don't think that circularity is a problem, because I could imagine like you could think of SafeSnap or any sort of off-chain snapshotting system is like an optimistic or like an escalation game, right? Where you vote there, and if there's disputes over what the vote was, you like go to a full on-chain expensive vote. But you want to avoid the on-chain votes if at all possible.
I get it. So you would still fall back to like some on-chain voting system if there's a dispute, instead of going right to the DVM if there's a dispute.
Exactly.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
It's kind of like, it's almost like you could think of it as the optimistic oracle for governance, rather than the optimistic oracle for like right now we use the optimistic oracle for all these financial contracts because we don't want to vote on everything. You could think of this as like the same sort of system, but for governance actions, because we don't want to vote on everything.
Yeah. Okay, that totally makes sense. So Clayton, I was wrong. You can totally do it. Just need that extra step.
But I actually do agree with you on the voting rewards thing. I think you'd want to come up, like in the UMA system specifically, I think you'd want to come up with some sort of reward mechanism for like off-chain voting, right? And it probably would be a little bit more complicated and convoluted because otherwise you just end up with nobody participating until it comes to an on-chain vote.
Yeah, unless they like if they view the increasing value of their treasury as reward enough, if they have like some kind of share of that.
True.
Sorry, I joined a little late, but can we talk about like how like the increase in flexibility you get from off-chain voting versus on-chain voting?
Yeah, I mean, you can define whatever kind of rules you can write out, basically. So with on-chain voting, every time you add some new calculation or you have to store some data or compose a transaction in some particular way, like you're adding more complexity and you have to pay for that with gas. But with off-chain, you can do whatever you want pretty much. Like even if it takes a while, even if it's some really like large calculation, you can still do it off chain and get it done in time. So I think in the Super Uman example, they want to look at NFTs that exist on Polygon, and based on those NFTs, determine voting weights for a system that's then going to be enforced on Ethereum. So that's like a few steps. That's not nearly as complicated as you could get with it, but that's way easier to do if you can just like go off chain and look at what's going on Polygon and then calculate and then submit the transaction based on the results, including the snapshot vote, which is like also off chain.
That's super cool.
All I was going to add, John, is I really like this phrase, optimistic governance. I just think it's like a good one. It's not just ours. I was actually just Googling it while you're talking, and like Aragon is using this, and like following some similar concepts. But I do think that we should try to co-opt it as much as we can, because I think it's a great phrase. Random comment.
One other random comment on just governance in general is I think there are a lot of things that are not great about our governance system and not great about our like voting system in general. It's expensive. It's two-phase. It's annoying to vote. But one thing I think that's really good about our governance system that very, very few other governance systems in the space have is the fact that you get rewarded for voting. And there's some sort of incentivization mechanism for actually doing the work of considering the governance actions and voting and making your opinion be heard. I think that's a really, really good thing. And so I think the direction of off-chain voting is a good one, and especially this optimistic governance concept is great. I would love to see like us somehow incorporate rewarded voting into that as well, like a way to compensate people for participating in governance.
That's interesting. I mean, you could actually bake it into, so you're doing this off-chain voting, and then you send a message to presumably some kind of multisig that holds the UMA tokens. And you say like, okay, multisig, submit the vote to UMA's system. You could also send it a message saying like, okay, distribute some voting rewards for our internal voting system. And I think that could be fairly easily baked in there. Like that's just kind of an extra vote. And that could be backstopped by the Oracle too, like make sure that like the amounts that people are getting are correct according to whatever rules were determined. And if so, distribute, if not, challenge.
Yep.
Is there a play with like the optimistic rewarder and optimistic governance here?
Could be, yeah. Because like the voting system could be based on like NFTs that you're holding. So that works well with the optimistic rewarder. Because it could be based on like anything, like the voting weights. It doesn't have to be like ERC20s. It can be 721s. It could be like just addresses recorded on IPFS somewhere of like these people are allowed to vote. So you could totally loop it into it.
It'd be nice to have an NFT for like showing how much you voted or whatnot, like reputation of some sorts.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
I don't know if this is a legit question or I'm having a brain fart, but there's plenty of governance things that are a matter of opinion. Like, should we do action X? Presumably those wouldn't be the kind of thing that would ever go through the optimistic oracle, right? Or how does that look here? It's just enforcing the X, right? It's sending the money to the destination. That would be the piece that would go through the OO.
Yeah, I think the simplest thing is like using the OO to enforce some vote that happened, where if it's a subjective question or a matter of debate, then it goes to a vote and you see how the vote went, and then you execute the results. That's the easiest to evaluate. More complicated is if you gave like, let's say you have sub DAOs or, you know, like pods that are spun up that have various things they're supposed to do. And like one group is supposed to like spend money on marketing, but then instead of spending money on marketing, they spent it on just like candy for themselves. I don't know. Like you could, with the protected token kind of way, you could look at that and say like, okay, this looks like this was bogus, and try to push a somewhat subjective but probably resolvable question through the oracle. That's definitely trickier though.
Gosh, that's really interesting, because imagine like then the candy vendors have these protected tokens that get rug pulled, and they should have like done diligence on the the authenticity of what they were paid in.
Right. Yeah, you wind up in a weird situation there. I mean, hopefully, like, because you know that this is going to end poorly, then it just doesn't happen. But yeah, the candy vendors get rug pulled in that scenario.
John, what what do you think we should build around this? Like the safesnap kind of integration, I think is kind of a given. I could see us like doing a whole new protocol on this, like the next across, so to speak. Just your opinion, like, and maybe even your evaluation of whether this is an idea whose time has come. Where would you like place this in UMA's like strategic priorities list to take this to the limit?
I think we'll learn a lot by having the safesnap integration and see if people take it up, because it gets to be just this behind the scenes plumbing for the most part, which is a good, place to be in some respects. So I don't really see how it gets like how it would be its own protocol, at least not yet, unless it looped in with the optimistic rewarder and some other stuff was happening where you needed to like break it out to make it clearer. But right now, if it's just like, okay, this is just a better enforcement mechanism for SafeSnap, I think that's fine and like unlocks a bunch of stuff because people are already using Gnosis Safe, so we don't have to convince them to do like that first hard part of putting money in there. It's just like, do you flip the switch that says UMA is now the enforcement mechanism for votes about what to do with the money? And if it's not getting picked up, I would want to find out why and see how it could be improved, and if that's something to do with UMA or just something to do with like SafeSnap or the general direction that governance is going. But I feel pretty good about it. Like it seems like at least a few people ought to try it out.
Could we get this integration approved as part of the Zodiac kind of suite of things that Gnosis have, or is that just Gnosis stuff that goes in there?
I'm not 100% clear on like what all goes into Zodiac versus what would be bucketed elsewhere. So I would say maybe. Like it's part of like the general ecosystem. So I think that we could definitely have a conversation with them and try to get like visibility on it for people that would find it useful. And if that's surfacing it in like Zodiac materials, I think that that's cool. But like I think it would be listed also just in their public documentation, because right now there's a slot there for like what's the arbitration mechanism, and reality.eth is kind of the only game in town right now, but they're open to other ones with like the snapshot X stuff and with the UMA integration. So
maybe you already addressed this, but how much participation from SafeSnap do we need to do this? Is this like an integration where we need to work closely with their devs?
Not really, but we do have contacts with them, and so we're going to talk with them. I don't think we would need to make it happen, but it's awesome that we are able to like go over our integration with them and get advice on it.
Mm-hmm.
Probably.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I think I interrupted like multiple people at once, but
I was saying cool, but nobody heard it, Sean.
Now no one knows it was cool.
It's cool, John.
Okay, good.
You probably already covered this because I joined late, but I was wondering how you were thinking about this from like a price identifier standpoint and like a voting resolution standpoint. Because they're like a common format for these like proposals that people can assess. We can kind of write into an UMIP, and I don't know, like I guess kind of the external governance is like the complicated part here, right? Like how do people judge what should actually be in like transaction data? Yeah, just curious on your thoughts.
Yeah, I guess with it, we should actually write this out as a UMIP, so I need to think a little bit more about that. But with Snapshot, you would be voting on a particular transaction that you're sending to your Gnosis safe. And then with this, you'd be enforcing to make sure that the transaction that goes through matches up with the transaction that was actually voted on.
So you'd kind of be like listing a snapshot proposal and also like a specific transaction, right? And then like the question would be like, do these two things match?
Yeah, something along those lines. So I should have probably come up with a slide for that. So that's a good call out. But that would be the basic idea. It's just validating the transaction that was approved off-chain and make sure that it matches what's actually going through.
Gotcha.
Is there any, so I'm not sure exactly how Snapshot or SafeSnap works in detail, but something I've seen in some Snapshot votes is that like the transaction itself is not like specified. It's just like a general description of what's going to happen or what's being proposed. So I guess one question is like, would it support that sort of setup where there's like just a plain text description of what they're going to do? And then two, is there a what does the DVM do, or what does the UMA voting system do if there is a proposal and the proposal lays out in plain text like, oh, this vote is going to send 100 UMA tokens to this address, and then but actually the transaction listed in that proposal does something completely different, right? Like it's malicious in some way. Does the DVM protect against kind of misleading snapshot votes? Because like in some ways, like I think of this as kind of akin to how the DVM says that it resolves prices based on these exchanges, but in the case of manipulation, the DVM is kind of allowed to override that if they think that kind of malicious activity is happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense. And I guess in the super Uman example case, for instance, they're using a tool that is then composing the like the script to calculate voting weights. And if the script deviates from their intention, I think we would want to go with the intention and kind of roll that back. So I think that's actually like a good extra layer. Like if there's a difference between the transaction, which realistically a lot of people are not even going to look at or even have the capacity to understand from what the plain text says you're voting on, then you could just cancel that, which I think is nice.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's like one of my, like, even beyond like the off-chain voting thing, that's one of the things that's always bothered me a little bit about Snapshot, or the Snapshot votes that I've seen, is that they're so qualitative in the way they describe things that like it's very unclear to me what transactions, like if that vote is approved, like what authority the multisig is going to assume.
Right. And I guess it depends too on like how people want to use this, if it would even be a good fit for the optimistic oracle to resolve the question, because there are these really subjective questions, and there's like you said, a lot of projects where that's really common. So I'm not 100% sure how you handle that. And I guess we do have some stuff baked into some of our identifiers where we're like, hey, we can't resolve this question, and we return some kind of value. And that's probably something that would belong in a UMIP where like, here's the return value if we're just like not sure. And, you know, you can tell us if you want to change it, like if you want to default to having it go through if we're not sure, or default to not going through if we're not sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think like in that case, at least for the vast majority of cases, if there's any ambiguity, you basically just say, hey, you're gonna have to vote on this again. Like throw it out.
Yeah. And I also, for the subjective ones that don't specify some kind of transaction, which might be just like send some money to this person or this other smaller group to go and distribute it from there. I'm not sure if there's anything to even enforce on chain. Like there needs to be some kind of transaction that we're looking at. And if it's like a subjective question where it's like send it to this address because this address is in charge of marketing, and the transaction is actually sending it to some other address, that's pretty easy to verify. So yeah, like there's got to be some kind of transaction because otherwise there's nothing for us to really do. Like if we say yes, go ahead, it still doesn't do anything.
Right, right. This has actually come up in the context of UMA voting as in like UMA governance votes as well. Like we've wanted, like for instance, we've had this kind of pain point around changing what an UMIP says or is, and like how like what the procedure is for modifying an UMIP. And you know, we've often talked about like, well, should we do a vote on it? But like there's nothing for the vote to actually do because you're changing this subjective consensus around what the UMIP is telling you to do. So there's no on-chain record of that. That's purely off-chain consensus. So yeah, I agree with you. I think there are going to be plenty of snapshot votes that are mostly like that there where there might not be anything on chain to really verify, which I think is kind of okay, right? Like that's actually what Snapshot is already good at. So like you don't necessarily need the Optimus Oracle to relay anything in that case. So I think that kind of works.
Yeah, I agree.
I have a question regarding this safesnap like integration. What kind of level of verification is expected from like UMA voters? Are they like supposed to verify like individual signatures of individual voters, or just rely that on the fact that the safesnap is working like properly and just you use those vote results at face value?
I would say take it at face value, except in like some kind of scenario where it looks like Snapshot was severely broken. So it's kind of like the thing where if we're looking at crypto prices, we like take the median of whatever, unless it looks like there was some kind of external event that we can identify that like something went terribly wrong. So we don't have to say like, okay, Snapshot was terribly broken, but unfortunately this is what Snapshot said. So the Uniswap treasury is drained. We could say like, well, normally we would just go with what Snapshot said, but everybody knows there was some horrible thing that happened. And so never mind about that. So that's kind of the way that I would look at that.
Yeah, it's kind of a fallback mechanism in the case, right?
Yeah. And like if we spotted something like very strange in the details, like we could do that. But I don't think it's expected to check every signature. We just assume that it works correctly unless we have some reason to think it isn't. So next time I talk about this, I'll have way more technical details. Sorry that there's not much code at all, but you know, I do think it should be done fairly quickly though, which is neat.
That is cool. I think you probably covered this already, but are the superhumans intending to have they like implemented one that's or safesnap already, or are they waiting around for us to kind of take the place of reality.eth?
They're not waiting on it, and I think it's fine for them to not wait on us. But right now the blocker is they're doing this voting weight calculation that involves NFTs on Polygon and enforcement on Ethereum. And I think they're running into issues with reality.eth where they're having trouble actually doing that calculation based on some Polygon information and then enforcing it on Ethereum. And I don't know if the blocker there is within safesnap or within the reality.eth like mechanism embedded in safesnap or what it is, but I'm going to help them troubleshoot that. But I encourage them to not wait on us, but I think that they're blocked anyway. And it's possible that us adding this is going to remove that blocker.
Gotcha.
As we don't need to use the full hour. This has been like super efficient, and I think John gave a great short and sweet presentation. Now we have a good conversation. I'm tempted to say we wrap it up.
Let's do it.
Sounds good.
Yeah, that was good stuff. Thanks, John.
Yeah, John, huge thanks. Thanks for doing this.
Thanks, John.
Yep.
Deal.
See ya. Thanks, Sean.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Mari.